Hi, and welcome to Crypto Conversations. My name is Vince Houghton. I'm the director of the National Cryptologic Museum here at NSA, and we'd like to welcome you back to another one of our virtual offerings. If you've had the chance to watch one of these before, we appreciate you taking the time to come and see one again. If this is your first time joining us for any of our programs, a special welcome to you. Please take a moment to check us out on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, and also on YouTube, where all the stuff we've done in the past, the virtual programming for the last 2.5 years since we've been closed, is available to you. We're working on getting the museum back open. Hopefully by not too long from now, you get a chance to come and see us at the National Cryptologic Museum. But until then, we have the pleasure today of having a conversation with the Director of Operations at the National Security Agency, Mr. Jon Darby. This is a situation in which we have an individual who has spent almost 4 decades working in the intelligence business. And that's one of the most extraordinary careers that we are going to talk about today. So I'm not going to give you too much more of his bio, because his bio is the conversation that we're going to have. So we're going to jump right in. So sir, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it. I know you're busy, so it's great that you took some time out to talk to us today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Well, let me start by asking you this, because most boys don't grow up saying, I want to be the director of operations at NSA. Most boys don't know that exists in the first place. For those out there who are thinking about a career in intelligence, or a career at the National Security Agency, or doing anything national security-wise, can you talk a little bit about how you got here? Like, when was there a certain point in high school or in college where you said, this is my career path, to do national security work, to do service to the country? Or was there a moment along the way? Was there an epiphany that led you down to where you are today?
Well, there was no magic path or anything I had planned long, as a kid. And actually, I went off to college planning to be a doctor. And my first biology class, I figured I don't want to be a doctor anymore. So and also where I went to college, I had to have a proficiency in a foreign language to graduate. So I took German for a couple of years, and the end of my sophomore year, my professor met with me and said, this is not really working out. You may want to try something else. So I switched to Russian and studied Russian, wound up minoring in Russian in college, and really was on a path to go to grad school. Didn't really know what I was going to do. And one day I was walking across the campus my senior year, and actually, I knew I wasn't going to make it back to my dorm. I had to go to the bathroom, so I went into one of the office buildings and saw on the bulletin board. We actually had real bulletin boards back then with paper,
right,
stuck into the cork. And there was a brochure there saying there was going to be a test for this place called the National Security Agency up in Minneapolis. I was in school in Minnesota. So I wasn't doing anything that weekend, so a buddy of mine got in a car and drove up to Minneapolis and took the test. I kind of knew vaguely what NSA was.
Well, that was a question I was going to ask, because today, most Americans probably have heard of NSA, for better or for worse. Back, I'm not going to age you, back at that point, you can age yourself. I'm not going to do it for you. I'll let you do that. I wonder, how much knowledge did you have, and how much did kind of society as a whole have about this agency? Because this is, the joke in the 80s and before was NSA stood for no such agency. And now, of course, there's a sign on 295 and on 32, and we do tours of the Cryptologic Museum. But at that point, was it something you understood what you were getting into? Or it was like, government job pays well, let's do it?
No, I really didn't know. I mean, one of the things, I said I was on a path to grad school, but I was thinking, hey, it might be kind of cool to work in intelligence somewhere, and I knew about CIA. I was thinking maybe I'll apply at CIA. And I'd seen some article, I think in Newsweek, about NSA, and I looked at it, and I went to the Career Center, but it sounded like it was a real technical job, technical place. I was a liberal arts guy, so I figured no room for me. And then I happened to see this brochure about a test, and it made it clear they were looking for liberal arts people. So I said, I've got nothing to lose, and went and took the test, and figuring that was it. And then I got a call back, and everything just kind of fell into place after that.
As I mentioned when I introduced you, you spent almost 4 decades at NSA, and there's a lot of transitions that you've gone through personally, jobs throughout. I think people don't necessarily know that you don't necessarily start in operations and spend 40 years there. You bounce from place to place. NSA does a great job of allowing people to try different things. But the country itself has gone through some pretty significant transitions when we're thinking about foreign policy goals and strategic aims. So you came in during the height of the Cold War. It wasn't the end. It was arguably one of the most dangerous years, talking about 1983. I want to ask you about what it meant from the NSA perspective to come in at that point, and then eventually the transition to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So that's interesting baptism of fire there, right? It's one of the most interesting periods historically. As a historian, it's such a wonderful period of everything changing all at once. So how was it that you, 23, 24 years old, to be thrown into that world of NSA?
Well, I'll start with, there have been a lot of changes in the world and in the intelligence community. I'll say for me personally, one thing that's been a constant throughout all is this business is really cool. I mean, and I tell people I came to NSA for really two reasons. One, I was getting paid a little more money than the job I had at the time after I graduated. And the second, I thought it might be kind of cool. Well, I'm getting paid more money now, but it's still a way cool place to work. And back to the changes that have happened. When I came to NSA, I really didn't know what I was getting into. And I came as a Russian language analyst and came in and I was focused on the Soviet Union. That was my piece, my role. And at the height of the Cold War. And it was just like you see in the movies in terms of, it was a spy versus spy, the big bear, the great bear against Uncle Sam. And then, the fall of the Soviet Union and things transitioned where Russia was not a threat and a big dip in resources devoted to the intelligence community. And then, 9/11 happened and everything changed.
Right.
And that was, I would say, anybody that follows the IC would know this, but that prior to 9/11, the intelligence community was fairly stovepiped, and information sharing was not the norm across organizations. When 9/11 happened, we realized across the board we needed to work more as a community and not different agencies.
Right.
And just the whole mindset and approach changed. And there was a sense of urgency at that point, a sense of, this cannot happen again, and we've got to work together better.
How much, most people don't really want to get focused on congressional legislation, all that's sexy and exciting. How impactful was the IRTPA? You got to have a better acronym for that. The Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, the one that creates the capital I, capital C intelligence community in the DNI. That transition to me, I always find interesting because for some people I've talked to at very high positions, like, we already knew we needed to do that and we just kept on keeping on. It was just Washington, bureaucratic maneuvering that really didn't matter too much. For others, it said it had a massive impact. What side of the fence do you fall in on those kind of formalized changes to create this community that, now we're going on almost 20 years?
I think it made a difference. It really leveled the playing field across the intelligence community. It wasn't a world of, with the director of Central Intelligence dual-hatted as the head of CIA, that was the center of everything. That other agencies were just as important across this IC. And the creation of the DNI really helped from a community standpoint, looking and operating as a community instead of several distinct agencies. Even though we were working together at the working level, which is where I was when that all created, it was good, I think, to have that mechanism at the top to help us bind together more closely.
So this is where I'm going to warn you ahead of time that we're starting to talk about things much closer to present day, and there's only a certain amount of things that we can say about when we get closer to present day. But I want to ask you about the transition of the last couple of years, where as the global war on terrorism begins to wrap up, as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan begin to wrap up, where direct support for the warfighter begins to be less of a priority. It's always a priority, but less of an onus on you as director of operations. And let's call it the great power competition comes back. Was that a revolutionary transit? Was that oh God, now we're having to start doing this stuff again? Or did you kind of ease into that transition, seeing it coming from a little bit of ways to allow you to kind of change direction at NSA?
Well, I think I'd say the way we'd characterize it, our entire cryptologic system had been optimized for counterterrorism. That was the top priority. That was the big national priority, frankly. So everything that we did, policy, process, technology, hiring, training, you name it, it was geared toward counterterrorism. And other intelligence needs that NSA had to answer kind of rode on the backs of an architecture that was optimized for that. Doesn't mean we didn't work all those other things. They were just not the top priority. And we realized we needed to shift this about 4 years ago or so. New national defense strategy, making it clear it's the great power competition. China is the top threat. Russia not far behind, and we needed to reorient this cryptologic system to be optimized for a totally different type of intelligence target. That frankly, I worked counterterrorism for nearly 10 years, and that was difficult. It's difficult finding one person on the face of the earth. It's difficult getting enough intelligence to stop every potential terrorist threat. That's hard. Put that next to China, and you look at the military, the scale of the military, the intent, publicly declared intent to be an economic superpower with global presence and influence, intelligence operations, technology development and proliferation. It's just the scale and scope is different, and so it wasn't you can't make a shift on a dime.
Right.
But we did recognize we needed to make a shift, and we have been making that shift.
Well, and I've talked to others and other agencies about this shift also, and the interesting thing to me is the workforce that was hired after 9/11 was very, very specific. It was targeted. It were people who spoke Arabic and other languages, and their language is important for Afghanistan, and people who focused on Middle Eastern studies. And that was true for quite some time. And all of a sudden, we need Chinese linguists and Russian linguists. Not all of a sudden, because we cared about them before. But was there a kind of change in kind of bringing on the younger generations and kind of from recruitment on up, how this took place within NSA?
Well, it's a combination of things. One, we did put more of a priority on hiring people with Russian and Chinese language skills. We've also developed cross-training programs to basically teach Chinese and Russian to current NSA employees that may have a language, an aptitude in a different language. But just as important is what's the enduring skill that we need, no matter what the primary target, as we say, is critical thinking. And somebody that thinks that way, and somebody that has a mindset of, when we produce the intelligence report, it's not over. It's how do we connect with the different operational communities that make use of that intelligence. So we had a whole host of people that have done that in the counterterrorism arena. And actually many of those people with that experience have shifted to work China and Russia. And that mindset and that approach, combined with a deep expertise in those areas, folks have worked many of those targets for years, decades, makes for a pretty powerful combination.
So I'm not going to ask you to name names. I'm not going to make you do that because that could be problematic. But there's a school of thought in history that focuses on in a kind of great men theory, where it's the presidents make history, or the prime ministers or the leaders make history. And if we apply that to NSA, the director would be that person. And you've served under now a number of directors since you joined NSA. Again, with that careers long, the directors tend to come and go every couple of years. Does it matter who the director is? Does it make a difference? And the workforce, for the most part, stays consistent. The directors tend, of course, have to follow. They're not in charge of everything. They're certainly under the president and everyone below it. Is the distinct personality of a director, even a deputy director, matter with how it feels to work at NSA?
I believe so, absolutely. I think the person at the top sets the tone, for how an organization operates. And I think how an organization operates is just as important, if not more important than what that organization does, because how you operate, that will be enduring, as the intelligence requirements and needs ebb and flow over time. So I think each director I've worked under has brought a different set of skills and style and expertise. Some, in my opinion, more effective than others. But I certainly think at this point, the NSA is lucky to have General Nakasone as a director. I think he's the right guy at the right time for what the NSA needed.
Let me bring that down to your level, because you direct the operations director at NSA. It's obviously one where you've been very busy. You can only say so much. I'll kind of preface a lot of things I say with that. But can you talk about your day-to-day? Like what does the director of operations at NSA do? Other than beautiful office and a lot of Cryptologic Museum artifacts around the office, what is what is the responsibility that you carry into work every day?
So maybe I'll start with kind of functionally what the operations directorate is and what we do, because I know that's a big mystery. At its core, we're the ones that produce SIGINT, signals intelligence. We're the ones that actually collect the signals. We're the ones that actually break the codes. We're the ones that actually translate the foreign language material we get. We're the ones that produce the intelligence reporting. All of that together, that's under the operations directorate. So that's my responsibility, to lead the people of that organization. What I do on a daily basis, I kind of joke, I just come in here and take a nap on the couch and everything seems to work out just fine. But it's a combination of things. As the leader of a big organization with that broad responsibility, my job's about vision, strategy, relationships across the community, budget, but also keeping a finger on some of the operational things, like right now, Russia, Ukraine, and what's going on there. As a combat support agency, we work closely with the military and others to support operations where our forces may be, and it's just a whole range of things.
Well, that must be one of the most difficult things of the job, much in the same way that General Nakasone has to deal with this. NSA, because it is almost kind of double-hatted as a Department of Defense agency, but also an IC agency, there is a upward customer, a strategic customer, the president, the National Security Council, Congress, but there's also a tactical customer. There's the warfighter on the ground. How do you split your time between those two? How do you make sure that you equally focus on, the second lieutenant on the battlefield in Iraq a couple years ago who needs information, but also the president who's demanding something that might change the direction of American strategy?
We have to do both. It's not an either or. And let me answer that kind of in a different way. If I look at the highest order operational goals that we try to achieve, in the operations directorate, it starts with, well, there's several things. We're looking to determine the plans and intentions of our adversaries. We're looking to learn what their capabilities are, to exercise those plans, capabilities such as weapon systems, armies, cyber capabilities, things like that. We're working to provide indications and warning of how those capabilities may be used, before they actually launch or do something or carry out a terrorist attack. So those three things: plans and intentions, capabilities, indications and warning, or I&W, as we say, and then finally link up with the operational communities and make sure what we're providing the right kind of intelligence to shape those operational outcomes. Those operational outcomes could be everything from helping inform a policy decision made by the President of the United States. It could be helping inform diplomatic negotiations for any number of things. It could be informing a military operation on the ground to try to disrupt some emerging terrorist threat. So it's the whole range of things, but the common theme is that our focus on the operational outcome, what we as the United States of America and our allies are trying to achieve.
You mentioned talking about how there's this feeling of community within the intelligence community. Let me ask you specifically about that, because you're in a position where kind of the equivalency across the board would be the deputy director of operations at CIA or people of that level. Is there a constant communication between, peers at the different agencies? Because I think, again, recent history will be declassified one day. A lot of it certainly still isn't. And I'm not going to say anything I'm not supposed to say. But there have been a lot of instances where we as the public, let me put myself as audience surrogate here, have learned that what we thought may have been one agency doing X ended up being a lot of different agencies working together to do it, right? There's truly a community involved in this. So how much is there a kind of constant collaboration and communication between agencies? Because SIGINT is just one piece of the pie, right? There's the human side things, there's the MASSINT, there's the GEOINT, all these things that are brought, there's a reason that there are 17 agencies in the IC. So how much of your job is working with those from the other IC agencies?
All the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just telling someone earlier today, I have regular calls with the Deputy Director of Operations from CIA. I have regular calls with my counterpart from FBI, for example. And we think nothing about picking up the phone and calling each other to work through things. So it's a constant dialogue. And frankly, aside from my personal interaction with those folks, as an organization, NSA can't succeed without the partnerships we have with CIA and other, and NGA and other agencies across the intelligence community. And I would, venture to say they probably say the same thing, that we really rely on each other. And many operations, and I'll point to Osama bin Laden operation, for example, you'd be hard pressed if you look at the core analytic team that worked at, say that person's CIA or NSA or NGA, because it was seamless how they worked together and brought the power of their respective agencies to get to a problem. Because at the end of the day, I say I don't care what agency is paying our paycheck, we're all part of Team USA.
Right.
And that's how we operate as one team.
Let me branch out beyond our borders, and let me ask you about your collaboration or coordination with those of, let's say, the Five Eye countries, whether it's GCHQ or Australian Signals Directorate or Canadian friends. Is that a constant too, where there is this interagency coordination with those that, the last time countries fought a war by itself, certainly the United States, I mean, we're talking hundreds of years at this point, but as you've moved through the ranks, has it gotten more likely that you would be in a position to collaborate with other agencies in the United States or other agencies around the world? Has that gotten better? Was it 9/11 that did it? Was it the 1990s and some of the operations other than war, like the Balkans or other places? Where did you see that starting to really kind of crank up to the level we're seeing now?
Yeah, I think a turning point was at 9/11. I mean, speaking of the cryptological relationship, the Five Eyes relationship has been in place for decades.
Right.
And in many places, the envy of other parts of the intelligence community, because we're so intertwined and so trusting of one another, and we work together as a team. 9/11 happened, and frankly, to be honest, I'd never dealt with any of them for years after I started. And the first time I interacted with the Brits, I was terrified I was going to say something wrong, because that was just, I'd never done that before. Right. 9/11, we recognized we needed to build even more partnerships, and not just with our Five Eyes partners, but other partners around the world. And at the time I was working counterterrorism, so that was a big part of my job, was dealing with other countries and finding common priorities, different capabilities, how we could help one another, combat terrorists around the world.
Let me ask you, about a year ago was the 10th anniversary of the raid on bin Laden, which you've talked about already. And at the time, a quite extraordinary article came out in Politico by a great journalist, I think you'd be okay with me calling him that, Garrett Graff, where you were quoted in it. And to some, it was a surprise to see an NSA representative in an article about the hunt and capture or kill of bin Laden. Was that something that you found a relief to finally let people know that NSA was involved? Because the narrative for going on 10 years was that it was CIA, not taking anything away from what CIA did, but they were basically the one everyone pointed, CIA and SEAL Team 6. Was it a relief to be able to say, you know what, we were involved in this as well? Because the public did not know that.
Yeah, I was glad that we got to tell, NSA was part of that story. And at the time, when the raid took place, I was I worked obviously at NSA. I was the senior most NSA official devoted full-time to counterterrorism. So the hunt and the operation was pretty much the full focus of my job for quite some time. But it was, and knowing that NSA was such an integral part of the hunt and actually supporting the operation itself, it was nice to actually see NSA noted publicly. And NSA made a strategic decision that, hey, it's been 10 years, it's time for us to talk about how NSA played a role.
Well, let me ask you about the specific time period leading up to the operation itself. Because you mentioned in the article the level of secrecy. I mean, this is a building where secrets happen all the time. Like we are a building of secrets. And but this took it to that next level, right? Where even though everyone who works here has cleared out the roof, there was still very few people who were in on it. And actually, even people working on the operation itself didn't know who they were tracking. Can you talk a little bit about how hard that might have been, or the difficulty of keeping such a, I mean, this is a big story, right, to yourself?
Yeah, and I think my quote in the article is, I've never been part of something as secret as this. And it was incredibly, protected and secret. So much so that at the time of the raid itself, you only had a few dozen people at all of NSA that knew what this was about. To include the director of NSA was on that list. Yet we had hundreds of people involved in supporting it. To just give you a sense of the level of secrecy and how it was protected, any updates that I provided General Alexander were verbal. Anything we wrote down was hand carried rather than emailed. The servers that where our written material was kept, only 3 people could access. It was locked down to that level of secrecy. And we had to have some kind of story, for all the other folks that were working. So we basically came up with a cover story. There was a U.S. military operation, near Pakistan, which, was true, but not the whole story.
Well, it's agencies are usually developing cover stories for the public that's not cleared. You actually had to create cover stories for your own people,
Yep.
Which is somewhat surreal because you don't get a job at NSA unless you're trusted to keep secrets. All of us go through that kind of clearance process, and even at that level, it just couldn't be spread beyond that, which I find extraordinary. And I think that
the stakes were too high.
Yeah.
And we just couldn't take a chance.
How did you feel the day of? Because you knew the schedule, you knew it was coming. And of course, there have been a lot of interviews with those that were in the Situation Room and the highest levels, the President Obama and Hillary Clinton and others. But you yourself, I mean, NSA's role is not necessarily something that we know every inch of, and we never know every inch of NSA's role. But it provided enough that we had a stake in the operation, right? Success or failure, there's a stake in the operation. So how did that day of feel for you and those that knew, like General Alexander? How did that feel waiting to find out word of whether or not it was successful?
Well, it was, I'll tell you, as I came into work that day, I was I knew the raid was going to take place that day. And as I walked across the parking lot, I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure he's there, but I don't know for sure. And I think the phrase I used with some folks was, I don't know that I'd bet my salary that he was there, let alone my presidency, which is basically what President Obama did, because the stakes were so high and so many things could have gone wrong with that raid. And then while the raid was taking place, I was in our command center here with General Alexander and a few other folks, and Admiral McCraven was relaying back what was happening as the raid was underway, and it was all just kind of, I remember thinking at one point, this is kind of surreal. This is actually happening, and then when we heard the Geronimo call, some of us in our command center, we looked at each other and wondering, what does that mean? And then we heard straight after that was HVT number 1, EKIA. And at that point, it clicked with me, like, wow, it worked. We got him. And it was amazing, because, so many people had spent so, had worked so hard for so long to find him. And that actually to hear that it worked was it was awesome.
One of the parts of that article that you were involved in that was really poignant to me was when you got a chance to go down and tell your people who they were actually hunting and out, that it was successful. Can you talk a little bit? Because to me, I stopped and I said, God, can imagine the feeling finally to be able to say, here's what you guys did. Now I can tell you.
Yeah, that's I left the command center and went to one of our, offices where there were probably 30, 40 folks that have been working for weeks, under this auspices of this cover story. Gathered them all around and said, I know you've been working hard. Let me tell you what this was about. And I told them what had happened, and just they all started clapping and cheering and yelling and hugging each other and crying. And it was really, it's a moment I'll never forget.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, just being in that room would have been pretty extraordinary, and finally be able to say, was there there's always this question that I get asked all the time about whether or not people are allowed to talk to their families about what they do, or tell friends or their parents or their wives or others. How much did your family know, your close immediate family know, that you were working late and going in early and doing all this stuff? Did they just assume it was just business as usual in the counterterrorism world? How did you keep that from the closest people to you? And how much of a relief was it to go call everybody up and say, and let them know, obviously, after the article came out, because that's when it was declassified, that this was something that you had worked on so closely?
So I'm going to tell you 3 stories about that, about my wife and my 2 kids. So a couple of weeks before the raid, I was out at dinner with my son, and he always kind of ribs me about, so what you up to, Dad? Because he knows I can't tell him. And he made asked that question, and he said, I could tell something was going on because you just said, stop it. We're not talking about it. And then he goes, something's going on. But we just kind of stopped it. My daughter, who was in school up in Boston at the time, she was scheduled to have her end of year choral concert that the Saturday when the raid originally was going to take place. And I called her up the Wednesday before. I said, hey, I'm sorry, I just can't come up there, because we'd planned this for months that I was going to go to this concert. And she was very cool about it. She goes, oh, okay, Dad, I know, you got an important job. And I mean, she knew I worked in counterterrorism, but she goes, okay, I get it. So the Monday after the raid, I just called her up to see how the concert was, and she picks up the phone and she's yelling in the phone, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, don't ever feel bad about not coming up to Boston again. And then, my wife, when I went into work, and I told her late that week, said I got to work all weekend. She goes, okay. I mean, this is kind of normal, not highly unusual. But then late that Sunday night, when it became clear the president was going to make his statement, I called her up at home and said, hey, you may want to turn on the television. And then by the time I got back home the following Monday night, I was here at work all that Sunday night, got home Monday, and she said, oh, you want a steak dinner? Clearly you were involved with this. This is a big deal. I said, no, I just want a pizza. And I sat down and cried my eyes out. It's just the tension, I just totally let go, because just the thinking of, all the people that worked so hard to find him and were persistent and never gave up. And that just brought a sense of closure to me, I think, too, personally, for, to hold to account the person that was responsible for 3,000 deaths.
Right. So on that, let me transition. That was very poignant what you just said, but I'm gonna goof it up a little bit when we ask you this question. Are you the most fun person, the least fun person at parties and barbecues and family reunions? Can you not say anything to anybody? Or has NSA allowed you over time to clear some fun stories? I mean, the ones about your kids and the bin Laden raid is fantastic, but are there things over the years that you can say? I mean, are you literally going to say, 40 years of my life, I can never tell anyone a soul about what I've done? Or are there things that you kind of can talk about now that are fun stories from your career at NSA?
Well, I mean, from the specific content of work,
Sure.
probably not.
Yeah.
But I've got some, story. And actually, on that note, my wife kind of joked. She says, "Hey, it's great to be married to somebody, and with a top secret clearance. That means we get to talk about me all the time, and don't have to talk about her."
When you never bring work home, too, right?
That's right. That's right. But I've got stories about. I mean, I've been blessed with all kinds of opportunities, gotten to travel the world and meet lots of interesting people and interesting experiences. I mean, just a few things that in an Asian country, when somebody asked to a very senior person asked to meet me in his big ornate office, and he sat down and apologized to me for it. That one of their warships running into a U.S. submarine. What? So another time, in Afghanistan, it was probably my first time there, and I was walking around, and I see everybody on the ground, and like, what's up? And oh, this is a duck and cover. Everybody needs to hit the ground, and I'm just walking along whoop-de-doo, fat, dumb, and happy, and not know what's going on. And meeting with other, foreign government officials. We went on a trip. I led a delegation to really ask for some help on a particular situation. And the person on the other end just stared at me stony-faced at the end and said, "We just want peace." And that was the end of it. I said, well, so much for that. That didn't work out so well. But it's just, it's just a sampling of some of the, interesting experiences I've had over the years.
At what point were you publicly acknowledged? At what point in your career?
Gosh, hard for me to say. I think, probably the first time I went out to speak publicly. And, I've given a few talks out in the public. And at that point, I was declared a public official, and known as NSA. Which I never would have dreamed would have happened when I first hired on.
And again,
there's no way. I mean, I would, when I first hired on, as you mentioned, NSA, no such agency. I couldn't even say I worked at NSA. It was, Department of Defense. And I would never have dreamed that I'd be, doing this right now.
Is that something that, this is the last question I'll ask you, because you've taken up way too much of your time. Is that something that you find refreshing? Is that something that kind of we're moving in the same path that CIA did, but they started a little bit before we did, about a decade and a half before we did. Do you find it important that the public is finding out more about what we're doing here?
I think it's extremely important. And really, I think it's great for the public to know what this agency does. And more importantly, it's not just NSA, the agency, it's all the people that make up NSA. I mean, we've got great people working at NSA, smart people, dedicated people, innovative people, motivated people that are here to do the right thing and want to make a difference for our country and our allies. And I am just, I'm so blessed to work with all these people. And it's just, it's an amazing place to work because of the people that work here.
Director of Operations at NSA, Mr. Jon Darby, thank you so much.
Thank you
for taking the time to talk to us.
All right, thanks.